Hi everybody, welcome back. My name is Christine Gillespie and I am the Retail and Tourism at Historic Huguenot Street. Just want to thank you for coming back to one of the many new digital programming initiatives that Historic Huguenot Street is doing since the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to be doing an excerpt from one of the books in our museum shop. Today we will be looking at the Women's Suffrage Movement by Sally Roche Wagner. Comprised of historical texts spanning 2 centuries, the women's suffrage movement is a comprehensive and singular volume with a distinctive focus on incorporating race, class, and gender, and illuminating minority voices. This one-of-a-kind intersectional anthology features the writings of the most well-known suffragists, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, alongside accounts of those often overlooked because of their race, like Native American women to African American suffragists like Ida B. Wells and the Three Fortin Sisters. At a time of enormous political and social upheaval, there could be no more important book than one that recognizes a group of exemplary women in their own words, as they paved the way for future generations. The editor and introducer, Sally Roche Wagner, is a preeminent scholar of the diverse backbone of the women's suffrage movement, the founding director of the Matlida Joslyn Gage Foundation, and serves on the New York State Women's Suffrage Commission. I just want to let you guys know that also featured in today's post will be links to the Matilda Joslyn Gage Foundation, so you can check out their website for some more information and browse their online shop. So we're going to, as always, start with our table of contents. And this book, unlike the ones that we've been reviewing in the past couple of weeks, this has a pretty hefty table of contents. It's divided up into different chapters along the suffrage timeline, which is really cool. I also enjoy that each chapter notes exactly what works are discussed in it, so you can see how it's broken down here, what's included and who originally wrote the piece or spoke the piece. And this book is different because it's, like I mentioned in the introduction, it's written in the words of these women. So a lot of the passages I will be reading were written by them, or they were speeches that these women had given, or articles and letters written at the time. So we're going to start with a section from our introduction. Movements don't have a beginning and an end. They are dams historians build in the river of history to capture the flow in a particular moment, and historians regularly move the location of those dams. The standard woman suffrage narrative by historians in the 1950s placed the beginning demarcation of the women's suffrage movement at 1848, marking the local convention for women's rights held that summer in Seneca Falls, New York. That narrative ended the suffrage movement in 1920, when the federal suffrage amendment became part of the Constitution. Scholars studying the pre-revolutionary period then recognized propertied women who voted in the colonies, weakening the 1848 dam, while those researching the 1830s female anti-slavery societies have suggested the beginnings of women organizing are to be found with these abolitionists. You'll see evidence in both of the following chapters. History is defined less by what happened than by who tells the story. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton sat down with her colleagues Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Joslyn Gage to tell the history of the movement in their 3-volume, 3,000-page History of Women's Suffrage, they dammed up the history of their movement from their personal perspective. A planner in the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, Stanton labeled it the first women's rights meeting held in the country. She may be correct, but it's also possible that a grade school student going through her local newspaper for her History Day project may someday find an account of women's rights meetings held before 1848, setting back that beginning marker. The location of the dams keeps shifting as our perspective and knowledge broaden. And I like how Sally acknowledges this point as to say, what we know to be the start of the women's suffrage movement is the most broadcasted, well-publicized event. There may have been movements before this in your local towns with your family members that may have started these. It's hard to say exactly where this began and when it moved forward from there. So I thought that was really cool that she acknowledged that even though this is what we know to be the suffrage movement, it could have started earlier than that. So in the first chapter, titled Women Voted Before the United States Was Formed, I'm going to read a few passages from this section for you guys. Women didn't first achieve the vote in 1920. They had political authority on this land before Columbus. As we celebrate women gaining political voice in the United States, the accurate story begins with the celebration of women who had political voice on this land 1,000 years ago. These women lived in native nations that tenaciously held on, as well as they could, to their system of real equality, despite the best efforts of missionaries, boarding schools, and federal and state governments alike to deprive them of it. They still do and are reclaiming their identity as sovereign women in sovereign nations. This story is essential not only because it starts in the right place, but it helps us understand how any white woman, ordered into God-ordained silence and subservience, and told by science it was their natural condition, found the courage to challenge all institutionalized society. They had to have seen something that gave them the idea it was even possible. They did. Their native neighbors. They saw, and they were inspired. Matlida Joslyn Gage saw the Native American model firsthand. She lived in central New York near the Onondaga Nation, which was, and is, the center of the 5 original nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. To the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, later joined by the Tuscarora. In her newspaper, The National Citizen and Ballot Box, Gage recognized the political sovereignty of 7 native nations, writing an editorial in support of the Council of Chiefs and their decision not to accept citizenship in New York State. She demanded that the government honor the treaties it had ratified with these nations. Perhaps most surprising is that Gage was given an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation in 1893, along with a clan name. I received the name of Ka-ron-ein-hawi, or Sky Carrier, or as Mrs. Converse said, the Senecas would express it as she who holds the sky. Her Mohawk sister said that this name would admit me to the Council of Matrons, where a vote would be taken as to my having a voice in the chieftainship, Gage wrote. How amazing this must have been to a woman who went to trial the same year for voting in a state school election. Considered for full voting rights in her adopted nation, she was arrested in her own nation for voting. So Matilda Joslyn Gage had a really unique opportunity based on where she lived and the relationships she was able to form. And it really goes to show you that the original settlers of this land had a very different way of running their clans and their tribes, and they were very matrilineal. This is the same for the people who once called New Paltz home. Women were able to hold power. They were able to vote on things, and you'll see women, they were able to sign the land deed to New Paltz between the Lenape and the Huguenots. So it's really interesting that this same woman was able to gain such high power within this clan of people, but she was arrested for trying to vote as a woman in a state school election. The next report I wanted to read you guys is in the chapter called Women Organized Before Seneca Falls, and this is touching on that period of time prior to the Seneca Falls Convention, where there may have been movements and congregations of women that were not as widely known. And this is Laura Lovell's report on the Second Female Anti-Slavery Society Convention in 1838. It says, Mrs. Weld proposed that we should, as far as possible, protect our colored sisters while going out, by taking each one of them by the arm. We passed out through a mob of 2,000 or 3,000 fierce, vile-looking men and large boys. They allowed us just room to walk, 2 abreast. We heard the worst language and saw the most hideous countenances, but I believe none were seriously molested. This was a new and unexpected scene to me. Our conversation was interrupted before 9 o'clock by the cry of fire. Pennsylvania Hall was in flames. The mob had accomplished the work by breaking in the doors and deliberately kindling a fire in the house, in view of the city of Philadelphia. We walked out to witness the speedy destruction of that beautiful building, which the diligent axe and hammer had been for months patiently rearing, that building which the friends not only of abolition, but the friends of free discussion, the friends of civil and religious liberty, and true philanthropists and patriots of our land had reared. What evidence have we in the flames now rising to burnish the heavens above, and spread consternation and terror through this fair city? What melancholy evidence of the wretched state of public morals! How have vice and oppression, villainy and outrage taken the rule? How are the pure and good driven from the still lovely spot whose foundations of beauty and order were laid in peace and liberty and love? And where are the magistrates of Philadelphia? Where are the laws which should protect the children of Penn? All leagued with this vile mob? But I will not dwell on the distressing scene. Suffice it to say that during the night, detachments from the mob were singing triumphant choruses through the streets, and in the morning they were still prowling around as if their appetite for destruction was rather sharpened than satiated by last evening's indulgence. Now, a lot of people already know that the women's suffrage movement was very closely tied to the anti-slavery movement, and they often worked together. They had similar people who would come and speak at rallies for each of these two groups of people, and this was very shocking to Laura Lovell to witness firsthand in Philadelphia, where our country began and was founded and all of these values were created, to see that such hatred still existed for not only people of color, but women also. On to Chapter 3, the 1850s movement takes off. My next passage, I will read from here. The women's rights movement had been around for decades, as women and men, singly and in groups, spoke, wrote, petitioned, and legislated women's rights. Seneca Falls, followed by other local conventions, signaled a change to the beginning of the organization. This buildup culminated in the first National Women's Rights Convention, held in 1850 in Worcestershire, Massachusetts, which formalized the structure to be taken by the Organized Work for Women's Rights. The list of 89 signers to the call read like a roll sheet of the most prominent reformers. More than 1,000 people from 11 states crowded the halls of the convention and listened to discussions of the medical education of women, their business capacity, and their position in the Bible. Dress reform was called for, and a woman new to the movement, Abby Price, argued that prostitution has economic causes and could be cured by opening profitable work to women. Her speech is included in this chapter. William Lloyd Garrison wrote, "I doubt whether a more important movement has ever been launched, touching the density of the race, than this in regard to the equality of the sexes." Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth attended, representing the interests of African Americans. So, the fact that these groups were getting together to have to prove themselves as people is a little crazy to me as a woman. And and having to fight for their desire to be medically educated or to have business capacity to run a business or to work in the workplace, and their position in the Bible, which is not anything that you would be proud of during this movement, considering that the Bible puts a woman second. It's just interesting to see what they were fighting for and who was there to fight with them. Also in this chapter, I wanted to read another section for you guys. A month before the birth of the National Women's Rights Movement, President Millard Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act into law on September 18, 1850, part of the Great Compromise between the slave-holding states and the Northern Free States, jerry-rigged by Kentucky Congressman Henry Clay. It was designed to put an end, once and for all, to any discussion of the issue of slavery in Congress. Fugitive slave cases would now come under federal jurisdiction. The safe zones northern states created when they abolished slavery were now illegal. No soil anywhere in the United States was safe for an African American, enslaved or free. All a white person needed to prove ownership of an African American person was a simple affidavit. Although on trial, accused black men and women were denied the right of trial by jury and were not allowed to testify on their own behalf. Anyone preventing the arrest of a fugitive or aiding in his or her concealment or rescue was subject to a fine of $1,000 and imprisoned for up to 6 months, with civil damages of $1,000 for each piece of African American property that purported owner lost by their actions. As the women's movement emerged, the anti-slavery movement kicked up its activity. The two movements were now in many ways inseparable, and would be until the end of the Civil War. With many of the same people active in both the anti-slavery and women's rights conventions, often held in conjunction with one another, the theory overlapped as well. And when you guys purchase this book, you can read a ton more about how the two movements are intertwined and how they work together. And there's so much information in this book that it's definitely a really good read. I'm just trying to give you guys tidbits from each section, but I definitely do recommend checking it out on your own. So this next part is from A Decade of Progress, Loss, and Refining Tactics. So we're moving towards the end of the movement and the end of the book. It says, with women voting illegally, suing the registrars who refused to register them to vote, and protesting their taxes, the stage was set to bring the burning question of women's suffrage to the highest court in the land. Virginia Minor, NWSA officer and president of the Missouri Women's Suffrage Association, and her attorney husband, who developed the argument that women possessed the vote under the 14th Amendment, would now be the ones to test it in the Supreme Court. Reese Haberset, the St. Louis Registrar for Voters, refused to place Virginia Minor's name on the voting list because she was not a male citizen, but a woman, and therefore ineligible to vote in the state of Missouri. He said, in association with her husband, married women under common law were unable to bring suit independently of their husbands. Virginia Minor sued for damages and lost both in the circuit court and then on the appeal to the Missouri court. The Minors carried the case to the United States Supreme Court, with Frances Minor acting as the chief attorney, arguing this landmark women's suffrage case in 1874. Since their task was to decide what the law was, not to declare what it should be, the judges had to rely on precedent. They determined, which over time established the Constitution never meant citizenship to confer the right of suffrage. Certainly, these 9 white men ruled, if the courts can consider any question settled, this is one. Unanimously, they decided that the Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone. So the state constitutions and laws that denied women the right to vote were legal. If anyone thought the laws were wrong, they should change them, the Supreme Court added. Gage, in a speech at the next NWSA convention, showed that the Supreme Court was wrong in asserting that the federal government did not determine suffrage, the states did. The full speech is then included in this chapter. And like I said before, this book is full of words that these women wrote themselves, like speeches or articles or letters, which I think is really neat, and you get a real sense of who this person was, not just another person taking their words and summarizing them. So it's a nice change just to be able to read exactly what they wrote and get the meaning behind the words that they put on the page. And the last passage I wanted to read to you guys is from the chapter, A Decade of Progress, Loss, and Refining Tactics. And this is taken from The History of Women's Suffrage, the book that part of it was written by Matlida Joslyn Gage. This is her description of the NWSA Centennial Protest in 1876. And she says, passing out, these ladies made their way to a platform erected for the musicians in front of Independence Hall. Here, on this old historic ground, under the shadow of Washington's statue, back of them the old bell that proclaimed liberty to the land and all the inhabitants thereof. They took their places, and to a listening, applauding crowd, Miss Anthony read the Declaration of Rights for Women by the National Women's Suffrage Association, July 4th, 1876. And she states in that reading, while the nation is buoyant with patriotism and all hearts are attuned to praise, it is with sorrow that we come to strike the one discordant note on this 100th anniversary of our country's birth, when subjects of kings, emperors, and czars from the old world join in our national jubilee. Shall the women of the Republic refuse to lay their hands with benedictions on the nation's head? Surveying America's exposition, surpassing in magnificence those of London, Paris, and Vienna, shall we not rejoice at the success of the youngest rival among the nations of the earth? May not our hearts in unison with all swell with pride at our great achievements as a people, our free speech, free press, free schools, free church, and the rapid progress we have made in material wealth, trade, commerce, and the inventive arts? And do we rejoice in the success thus far of our experiment of self-government? Our faith is firm and unwavering in the broad principles of human rights proclaimed in 1776, not only as abstract truths, but as the cornerstones of the Republic. Yet we cannot forget, even in this glad hour, that while all men of every race and clime and condition have been invested with their full rights of citizenship under our hospitable flag, all women still suffer the degradation of disenfranchisement. The history of our country, the past 100 years, has been a series of assumptions and usurpations of power over women in direct opposition to the principles of just government, acknowledged by the United States as its foundations. And then she goes on to read the foundations of our government and how unjust everything is towards women and the how favorable they are towards the superior people or men or the Caucasian men. So this book has some very powerful messages and it has very powerful words taken directly from these women. I highly recommend the women's suffrage movement. Sally Roche Wagner, I had the privilege of seeing her speak at a conference last year. She's a very dynamic person, and her writing and her passion for this topic are very strong. And I also wanted to mention the foreword in this book was written by Gloria Steinem. So that's really cool too. So if you're interested in purchasing a copy of the Women's Suffrage Movement, this is what the book looks like for this edition. Here is the book jacket. We have it in our online store currently for $18 plus tax and shipping. Starting today until May 20th, you'll receive 10% off the book and its original price. If you live locally, we can arrange a safe pickup for you. If you don't, we can gladly ship it out as soon as possible. And I do want to say, thank you guys so much for tuning in again. If you have some time, check out the link provided to check out the Matlida Joslyn Gage Foundation, and stay tuned to see what we have going on next week. Thanks.